Hey everyone, hope you are faring well. Thank you for joining us for another Fugue Office Hours, where we are putting engineers in command of cloud security and compliance. Today, we're going to take a dive into capturing configuration drift in an AWS environment, reviewing those drift events to determine
We're going to take a dive into capturing configuration drift in an AWS environment, reviewing the...
Whack that, sorry about that. All right, so yeah, today we're going to dive into capturing configuration drift in an AWS environment, reviewing those drift events to determine which are legitimate and desired and which might be a cause for concern. Cloud misconfiguration is the #1 cause of cloud-based data breaches, and we need to be aware of misconfiguration events quickly so we can remediate them before bad guys can find them. And they're using automation to find these vulnerabilities pretty quickly. Before we get started, I wanted to let everybody know that this Thursday at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, we're hosting another Cloud Security Masterclass. This one is a part 2, focused on locking down the security of AWS IAM. So please come join us for that. Again, this Thursday, 1 p.m. Eastern. These sessions are a lot of fun, and they're designed to help you think more critically about securing your specific cloud use cases. I'm going to post a link in our chat to register for that, so come join us. So now we got the housekeeping out of the way. Let's get on with this. Hey, Ricardo, how are you doing? Good. How are you doing?
I'm good.
Nice, nice. So I kind of set it up, but you're the man with the plan. What do you got in store for us?
Yeah, I think I've kicked off every session with saying that it's not going to be that long, but so I'm going to kick this off with this isn't going to be an extremely long session, but if it is, so what? Anyway, what we're talking about today is drift. So we touched on it a little bit when we had our long conversation with Josh, which was really good. But one of the things that we always talk about at Fugue is capturing drift, knowing what's changing in an environment. Being able to review that, figure out whether it's good change, whether it's bad change. One of the things that Josh gets to do, Josh and team, which is really cool and fun, is whenever there's breaches, Josh goes and recreates the breaches, and he basically gets to hack his own account. I think with my job and working with a lot of our enterprise customers, what I do is kind of recreate a day in the life of kind of what they deal with, what they see. And help them to get an understanding of what's going on in their environments. So it's not quite as fun. The fun part for me, though, is kind of messing around within AWS. So what I did for today is basically I just launched a web app. So I just created it using Beanstalk. And what I wanted to figure out is what changes are happening within my AWS account and what is Fugue capturing. So if you recall, I had created a separate environment that has all my office hours stuff, so stuff that we do for these office hours. So we're just going to review some of the changes. So see what happened, see what I did, and honestly, it was a simple kind of web app, kind of their introductory web app, single EC2 instance using Elastic Beanstalk. And I was just curious to find out all the changes that happened. And what we always find out within AWS is you seemingly do something fairly small, but there are a lot of changes. And a lot of times we agree, we say, AWS, it's okay, make these changes to the role policy, whatever. But so let's just take a look. So I always start out with showing the visualizer. Let me share my screen.
It's always a good place to start.
Always. So, Drew, can you confirm that you're seeing it?
Yep, indeed.
Cool. So, if you saw previous office hours, what we did was kind of segment the network, basically, or I should say, segment the environment. So, I have this as a kind of global office hours environment, looking at everything, scanning everything. Visually, you can see everything. So, everything that's in my account, you can see it, all the regions. What I did was kind of break it up to be a smaller environment, just consisting of this Canada network, which I endeavor to clean up at some point. But for now, I'm just going to play around in it. So when we look at the visualizer, we'll see that things changed a little bit. So not a lot changed. But what we have within the visualizer is, let's centralize this a little bit more, is we see everything that I've deployed out here. So compliant, non-compliant, everything is out there. And then we get all of these sort of red marks. We see S3 buckets, which weren't on there before. So if I go back to, see, when we created the environment, it looked like this. So not a ton of change. Didn't have the S3 bucket. There's some additional security groups that we were evaluating. So some subtle changes, but change nonetheless. And when we start realizing and understanding what the changes are within the environment, that's when we start talking about baselining. So again, just to kind of reiterate some of the things we talked about previously, is each one of the elements in here, you can see configuration attributes. And this is what we are capturing when we establish a baseline. So what's really important for our customers to understand is you really want to understand whenever there are any configuration changes. So a configuration is a modification to these attributes. It could be adding additional resources, but just making sure you have an awareness and then some sort of methodology to go back to make sure that those changes are adequate changes. They're changes that are approved, whether it goes through a change control process or just changes that you're aware of. And that's really what baselining is all about. So with Fugue, we did that with Josh on the line using the CLI, but here you can just establish a baseline. So you can click a button. So this was how the network, how the environment looked on that particular day. We fast forward to today, where I've made some modifications, and we'll see that. So how did we capture that? So within this network, if you recall, I have just a subset of the Canadian environment. And even at the time, I wasn't looking at all of the resources within the account. So for that, I'm going to switch over and look at another environment that I have, which has everything. So this looks at kind of the global scan of everything. So all of the changes and the events that happen. So again, what I did was a couple of clicks in the AWS console, basically launching Elastic Beanstalk application, just a simple web app, and let kind of AWS do its thing. So in that, we established a baseline, and then what I wanted to see was what changes happened. So what transpired in the account. And then we can actually just go through it. So that's what we have here. So on the screen, it's always interesting to me, like the more I play around and stuff and, click in different services, you see all these different roles, you see policy attachments, you see additional resources created. For example, you have this, a new S3 bucket. So this is the Elastic Beanstalk bucket. The good thing is the creation of it while automated, and I didn't have any control over the configuration. It is private, so that's cool. We get the ARN bucket information. Don't have version enabled, don't have MFA delete on there, so those things are false. But I can go through and I can look at all of these things. So we have a role policy attachment. We get to look at that. The role is the Elastic Beanstalk service role. And just different permissions. So we have an additional instance profile that's associated with my EC2 role that was created. So we talk a lot about instance profiles and being able to change your permissions, being able to accelerate or move around within AWS using the different instance profiles. So we see that's created. So that's another thing out there. We see a role policy attachment. Let's see, Beanstalk multi-container Docker. So this is a policy ARN, and here's another one that's attached to an EC2 role. So a lot of stuff that's going on simply with that, just adding that service. So when you start thinking about it in an operational sense, you have people within your environments, within your accounts that are doing things all the time. They're making modifications, they're updating services, and we at Fugue don't discourage innovation at all. Obviously, we innovate. We continue to add features to our product. The point we try to stress office hours and things like this and these kind of conversations that we have is you need to be aware. You need to be able to capture these sorts of things. So all of the drift that is contained, you'll see different filters over here. So you see filter by detected date, today, past week, month, year, all time. So this is something that Fugue is going to capture for the existence that this environment is created within Fugue. So it's always nice to be able to go back to see what changes have been made, how they have impacted the environments as well. Going back to the other view, when we now start looking at some of these things, let me make sure I'm current, some of the things that we just brought up, we see that there are a number of non-compliant evaluations. And in this environment, I'm trying to remember what I'm checking. So I'm just looking at CIS, Fugue best practices, CIS controls. But even in that bucket that was created, it's a non-compliant bucket just with those controls. And we really see CIS benchmarks and CIS controls as kind of the foundation, along with Fugue best practices. There are a number of security checks that are within Fugue best practices, but just this automated creation, we see there's a number of things that technically aren't good. So this has to do with encryption. So it's created this bucket for this app. It's not encrypted. Usually something that you would probably configure in your application, but if you're doing it, just uploading your code to and allowing AWS to do the work, we know that's not going to be compliant. This thing only allow requests for HTTPS. So this is a web app. So this may be something, actually with this bucket, it should be encrypted, the transport. We can allow HTTP through the security group. So we would have to take a look at that. Block all public access. This is a Fugue best practice. So that's not setting on there. It is private, but block all public access isn't on there. And then when we look at the access logging, so there's no access logging that's set up. So kind of out of the box creation, you already know it's not compliant. You already know that there's some risks. And just by having these 3 controls turned on, we're alerted to that. So a lot of good information we gleaned from that. We look at the security groups. Let's see. So this was the security group that I added. Let's see what's wrong with this. So this one is a ingress, ingress from anywhere to port 80, unless through an elastic load balancer. So technically the configuration, the way that it's set up is incorrect. So the way that we deploy it, if we use the basic kind of deployment settings, what it's doing, it's allowing access directly to this specific instance versus through a load balancer. So that was one of the things that I wanted to clean up in this environment anyway, is to add some load balancing. But the good thing is I'm alerted to all this. Turning the Fugue baseline on, we see that. And now I know what needs to be fixed. I also know that maybe it's not the best idea to allow kind of the launch wizard to deploy my web app. I should probably take a little bit more control of that, especially from a security standpoint, to make sure that I'm following a lot of the best practices. So that's really what I wanted to highlight. Do let me know if there's anything that you could think of along those lines that I could touch on. But again, like I said, this wasn't going to be a super long one, but obviously stressing the importance of being aware of everything that occurs within your account, within your environments. That report, just getting a report of all of the events that happen, things that are added, it's just an invaluable resource. Users added, role permissions, role policy attachments. I pictured myself, I view it as me just deploying a simple web app, but really I've kind of exposed a lot of things. I've done a lot of things wrong by just allowing, kind of the launch wizard within AWS to do it myself. I really need to take control of that and figure out, a better way to do it. This was more of an example of things that people are doing on a daily basis. So really gives you some insight as to what really happens within these accounts.
Yeah, so there's a couple of use cases for Fugue's drift detection that I've talked to our customers about like how they're using it. When one is, somebody who says, I've got developers all over the world. Everybody's working remotely, and with Fugue, I can check what they're doing, on a daily basis or maybe a couple times a day, and bring up Fugue to see the changes they're making to environments or new infrastructure they're spinning up, and immediately find issues with what they're doing. So I can call them up and tell them what they're, explain to them what they're doing wrong, or maybe file a ticket and assign it to them. So it's kind of a great way to just kind of let your team do their work, but keep an eye on them to make sure they're not breaking the important things.
Yeah, sometimes I think because we work in this space on a daily basis, I think sometimes the way we discuss it, we oversimplify it. I know I'm guilty of it. And in a lot of cases, we're looking at it maybe on a smaller scale on a single environment, but kind of our mantra is really bringing this to the developer, to the operations person that is working within a single account, so that they can take control and be aware of those things. But like, as I go through all of those issues in that simple kind of that web app deployment,
Yep.
I mean, it's some serious stuff. I mean, there's flaws in the architecture itself, just the way that, you would want to deploy an application, but just kind of looking at some of the basic things like encryption and logging and being aware of what's happening within the account. And we look at that page of events that Fugue captures. I mean, that's some serious stuff. There's literally, with me clicking 2 or 3 buttons within my console to launch that app, I mean, there's literally like 15 events, 15 changes that are happening, modifications, adding a security group. I mean, serious stuff. So, I don't want to downplay it or oversimplify what's happening there, but we start thinking about it at scale. So, we have customers that have hundreds of accounts. So we can only imagine kind of what they have to deal with from a security team perspective, and managing all that sort of data, that drift data, and getting a hold of that. So, it's a serious topic, and I honestly think the way, because we capture drift in establishing that baseline, it's not things that we think are concerning. This is, making administrators aware of everything that's happening within their accounts. So any change from the moment I establish that baseline, any change is being captured, and I will want to be alerted to that. So, I mean, I think it's really something that we can't, understate. It's true.
Yeah, there's something related to what you were just talking about with, like, Beanstalk is executing a whole bunch of things. You might not be aware of everything that it's doing. The same is true with infrastructure as code, and we're massive fans of infrastructure as code here. Way better to approach, building and modifying infrastructure that way than clicking around in the console. But I think what a lot of people don't understand is even if their Terraform file looks good, there's a lot of missing pieces to a lot of those files that might then kind of revert to, like, on AWS, it could be like AWS defaults that are not expressed in your infrastructure as code. So you could go build stuff and then wind up with non-compliant infrastructure with some serious misconfiguration vulnerabilities, but you would never have seen that just by reviewing what your infrastructure as code is supposed to go build.
Yeah, it's true. So unless it's like, in a lot of cases, unless it's explicitly called out, so unless you call out, to deploy in this specific VPC, it'll just go to the default VPC in a lot of cases. If one of the things that often happens, and I'm laughing because this came up in a conversation earlier with a customer, was, if you don't define, so as you go through, you're defining your policies, your instance policies, essentially what that instance can interact with. We're all human. We get to a frustration point. I'm speaking from experience in my own guilty way, where I've done this. I needed to make a modification, or this instance is not speaking to this area of the infrastructure, and it's frustrating to me, and I cannot get my Terraform file to work properly. It's not compiling, it's whatever. So I'm just like, oh, screw it. And you go into the console, and then you may change like your role policy and your permissions, and I'm just going to star this. So I'm just going to do any for now, just for now. I'm going to come back and fix it. I mean, that's like real world type stuff.
Well, that's getting it done right now and getting
it. I mean, you get frustrated. You honestly, I mean, if you deal with this stuff long enough, and I know, and I'm a Terraform fan, so I'll say that. But I know with the different upgrades and the different changes that and iterations that Terraform has gone through, the way that the syntax is expressed. So the way that I did it, 6 months ago, it gives me errors when I'll do it now. So I don't have the proper syntax. I'm not updating it. Yeah, I'm going to screw up my state file, but I need to get this done now. So I'm just going to go in the console and do it, and I'll go back and fix it later. Yeah, right. But that's just the reality. I mean, that's the reality of infrastructure. That's the reality of being in the cloud. And that's one of the reasons why we like the cloud, because we can do things fast. We can get things done. And, we make a case for Fugue to say, let's get a watchful eye on that. Let's establish a baseline. And when Ricardo screws something up, and the other thing that I see is when I do things like that, and then I get that drift report on the things that I've changed, I can actually go back and make that modification if I needed to modify that infrastructure as code, redeploy it. Now, we won't talk about Terraform recreating stuff and get into all that sort of mumbo jumbo, but the fact of the matter is it tells me what I've done, and it tells me what's been created, and if I need to go back and delete it or modify it or whatever, I can do that because those changes are captured. And that's, I guess I didn't really point that out as well. In the detail, when there is a drift, when there is an infrastructure change, and that was mostly add. So that was mostly adding new resources. But when there is a change, what Fugue reports on is the previous state as well as the current state. So that's obviously good. Like you mentioned, creating tickets for that. If you got an alert, something changed, somebody could go back and revert that back manually.
So that, yeah, and kind of the other issue is, it's faster and more efficient to use something like Terraform to build or modify large environments, but it's also faster a lot of times if I just need one change or I need to open up a port to do some maintenance. I'm not necessarily going to be using Terraform to make that modification and then change it back. I might just go into the console, make the change. So I'm going outside of that the automated path, and a lot of times people don't close the door behind them, and Fugue is something that's going to catch that.
Yes.
So you I think you have a lot of people that are using like infrastructure as code, which is absolutely the right thing to do, but then they look at their infrastructure as code file that they used last week to deploy a bunch of infrastructure, and they assume that that's what's running.
Yes.
And we know that's not the case.
No, and that's we've often in our engagements referred to Fugue as a state machine, because it's really, when you're working in teams deploying infrastructure as code, you're typically doing portions of it, or you may be responsible for a specific application. So you're really deploying resources for a specific application versus everything that's in an entire account. So sometimes there are differing. The state files it's not going to be uniform. It may be held in different places. In fact, some people may have it at their desktop, just if they're kind of just doing a Terraform apply for their desktop. So from that standpoint, yeah, you're right. You may think that what you have out there is what should be there, and it's not. And so that's when you run your Terraform plan and you see what's going to change or what's changed, and you're like, well, why is anything changing? All I'm doing is adding. So there should only be this section. This group of resources that should be in adding as opposed to modifying, and then it gets to a mess. But I guess the bottom line and the point is set a baseline.
Yeah.
More than anything else, it's just going to give you just a level set of awareness of what's going on within the environment.
Sure, and just in recognizing that there's going to be change that happens that is outside of your normal path of operations. I don't know if it's a common myth or misconception. I know we've run into it a couple times with maybe a new customer that says, no, every change that we make to our environment goes through our CI/CD pipeline. There's nothing outside of that happens. And it's like, okay, well, set a baseline and come back in a week and let's have a conversation. And it's usually like, oh my God, we had no idea how much change was happening to our environment outside of the CI/CD pipeline.
Yep, those are. I'm going to say from where I sit, those are fun engagements.
Yeah.
We've had some uncomfortable silence in engagements where customers are kind of seeing, whether they're non-compliant or where the holes are, or the changes that have happened over the course of the week, as you mentioned.
Right. Well, yeah. And I mean, people that are like, well, we've passed, a compliance audit, like a manual audit, and, we might find a lot more issues in their environment. And that's that, I guess, for them to reconcile and see how they want to proceed. Compliance is sort of a, nebulous area, but obviously Fugue can help considerably there, at least when it comes to cloud infrastructure. But people that think that they don't have misconfiguration vulnerabilities, it's why we created the Fugue best practices, because we're seeing cloud misconfiguration exploits out there that just simply would not have been flagged by CIS or SOC 2 or some of these other families. And don't get me wrong, obviously those families are critical starting point to securing your cloud infrastructure. But those compliance regimes, those organizations maybe tend to move a little slower than the market of bad actors that are finding pretty creative ways to get access to your environment and walk off with your data.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing, if you think about it, they are kind of an overarching set of best practice, to themselves, because they don't specifically know IAM. Mm-hmm. They may not know all the things that you can do within all the different elements and attributes associated with IAM, where they may say, you need to secure things this way, or you need to make sure that, your passwords aren't being reused and that they, are set up this certain way. But they're not going to look at some obscure service that AWS introduced, and which is a great service and a lot of people are using. But if you open that port up on your security group, there's a way that somebody could get in and do bad things within your environment. So, and you're exactly right. That's why, Fugue best practices exist, to check on those things, and we're constantly adding to it. And it's part of our processes of iteration within the product, also checking our rule evaluation. So this is what we do.
Yeah. And then one subject I want to put a pin in for a later office hours is kind of more of an ops use case of using Fugue and the drift detection to validate legitimate deployments that you make. So if you're deploying a bunch of new infrastructure or making a bunch of modifications to an existing environment, Fugue will capture all those change when it happens, and then it gives you a really easy way to say, did all of the changes that we wanted to make and intended to make happen the way we wanted to, and nothing else happened. And of course, did anything that we just did trip up a compliance violation, so we can correct that. And that might be a neat office hours at some point soon.
Yeah, I'm not going to commit to it for next week, but I know in terms of the process, just the pipeline command wise, I mean, our CLI is pretty awesome. So yeah, that would be really good to just go through that process, maybe show kind of the pipeline, using the command line, seeing those changes, capturing the drift. We look at it manually, and then maybe there's a manual stage of approve or disapprove of the pipeline. If we decide we don't like the changes, roll back the pipeline, do a Terraform destroy, delete stack, however we want to go about it. I think that would be good.
Yeah,
we'll definitely do that. Another option for next week that I was thinking of is touching on the custom rules a little bit more. I know that's come up in a couple of customer meetings that I've had, where folks are just looking how to implement it, and kind of at a basic level. Maybe it's tagging, maybe it's looking at volume encryption. maybe there's not a big concern for compliance, and I could probably do this in one of the environments that I just created, but just having a list of custom rules that I'm checking versus kind of hardcore security and compliance. So
sure. It might be we're allowed to operate in this region, but not in like an EU region or versa. There's just a lot of policies that you can express on, what you're allowed to do and not allowed to do, that you're right, are not necessarily, they might be more compliance oriented and not as much security oriented, or they might not have anything to do with either compliance or security, but just something that's important to.
Yeah, it could just be kind of corporate governance.
Yep.
So we'll throw those out there. I think if we get some feedback from some folks on what's most interesting to them, we'll play it by ear. But I think that'll be a good
custom policy sounds like a pretty good one.
I won. You're not even gonna fight me on that?
No, we need to cover that one. Everybody needs their custom policies, so we might as well cover it. Let's do it.
We'll do it.
Awesome. All right, everybody. Well, thanks for stopping by Fugue Office Hours. This is fun. We love having you. And every Tuesday at 4:00 Eastern Time, we're doing this. So bookmark it, smash that subscribe button.
We got to start encouraging that.
Subscribe
and like
subscribe and like our video and hit the notification bell and like all the things that all the other YouTubers say that you need to do. So cool, awesome. Thanks, Ricardo. This was great, and we'll see you next week.
Have a good one.
Cheers, everybody.